Shalom, shalom, and welcome back. Welcome back. Peace be unto you all tuning in today. I hope you've been listening to the episodes prior to this. Um, Let me change my avatar because we're not talking about sex right now. Um, Today we're, as you can see the title, still talking about the Passover, and today will be talking about the Passover versus Easter and the topic of eating the gods and what that means. I'm still reading from the book, The Golden Bough, or Bow, however you want to say it. And I'm just going to jump right in. So, this particular part of the book is called the Easter Fires. So we're just going to touch on different things around the world and see what everybody is doing around this time to see if what we're doing in any way is associated with any other thing that anyone else is doing. So we want to know if what we are doing is correct, if it is pagan or if it's not. What constitutes pagan and what doesn't. We just want to know what it and who it is we worship. We don't want to worship we know not what. So let us find out. Okay. So the Easter fires. Another occasion on which these fire festivals are held is Easter Eve, the Saturday before Easter Sunday. On that day, it has been customary in Catholic countries to extinguish all the lights in the churches and then to make a new fire, sometimes with a flint and steel, sometimes with a um, sometimes with a burning glass. At this fire is lit the great Paschal or Easter candle, which is then used to rekindle all the extinguished lights in the church. In many parts of Germany, a bonfire is also kindled by means of the new fire on some open space near the church. It is consecrated, and the people bring sticks of oak, walnut, and beech, which they char in the fire and then take home with them. Some some of these charred sticks are thereupon burned at home in a newly kindled fire, with a prayer that God will preserve the homestead from fire, lightning, and hail. Thus, every house receives new fire. Some of the sticks are kept throughout the year and laid on the hearth fire during heavy thunderstorms to prevent the house from being struck by lightning, or they are inserted in the roof with the like intention. Others are placed in the fields, gardens, and meadows with a prayer that God will keep them from blight and hail. Such fields and gardens are thought to thrive more than others. The corn and the plants that grow in them are not beaten down by hail, nor devoured by mice, vermin, and beetles. No witch harms them, and the ears of corn stand close and full. The charred sticks are also applied to the plow. The ashes of the Easter bonfire, together with the ashes of the consecrated palm branches, are mixed with the seed at sowing. A wooden figure called Judas is sometimes burned in the consecrated bonfire. And even where this custom has been abolished, the bonfire itself is in some places goes by the name of the burning of Judas. The essentially pagan character of the Easter fire festival appears plainly both from the mode in which it is celebrated by the peasants and from the superstitious beliefs which they associate with it. All over northern and central Germany, from Altmark and Anhalt on the east, through Brunswick, Hanover, Oldenburg, the Harz district, and Hesse to Westphalia, the Easter bonfires still blaze simultaneously on the hilltops. As many as 40 may sometimes be counted within sight at once. Long before Easter, the young people have been busy collecting firewood. Every farmer contributes, and tar barrels, petroleum cases, and so forth go to swell the pile. Neighboring villages vie with each other as to which shall send up the greatest blaze. The fires are always kindled year after year on the same hill, which accordingly often takes the name of Easter Mountain. It is a fine spectacle to watch from some eminence the bonfires flaring up one after another on the neighboring heights. As far as their light reaches, so far in the belief of the peasants, the fields will be fruitful and the houses on which they shine will be safe from conflagration or sickness. At Volk Marsen and other places in Hesse, the people used to observe which way the wind blew the flames, and then they sowed flaxseed in that direction, confident that it would grow well. Brands taken from the bonfires preserve houses from being struck by lightning, and the ashes increase the fertility of the fields, protect them from mice, and mixed with the drinking water of cattle, make the animals thrive and insure them against plague. As the flames die down, young and old leap over them. As the flames die down, young and old leap over them, and cattle are sometimes driven through the smoldering embers. In some places, tar barrels or wheels wrapped in straw used to be set on fire and then sent rolling down the hillside. In others, the boys light torches and wisps of straw at the bonfires and rush about, brandishing them in their hands. In Munsterland, these Easter fires are always kindled upon certain definite hills, which are hence known as Easter or Paschal Mountains. The whole community assembles about the fire. The young men and maidens singing Easter hymns march round and round the fire till the blaze dies down. Then the girls jump over the fire in a line, one after the other, each supported by two young men who hold their hands and run beside her. In the twilight, boys with blazing bundles of straw run over the fields to make them fruitful. At Delmenhorst in Oldenburg, it used to be the custom to cut down two trees, plant them in the ground side by side, and pile 12 tar barrels against each. Brushwood was then heaped about the trees, and on the evening of Easter Saturday, the boys, after rushing about with blazing bean poles in their hands, set fire to the whole. At the end of the ceremony, the urchins tried to blacken each other and the clothes of grown-up people. In the Altmark, it is believed that as far as the blaze of Easter bonfire is visible, the corn will grow well throughout the year, and no conflagration will break out. At Braun Road in the Harz Mountains, it was the custom to burn squirrels in the Easter bonfire. In the Altmark, bones were burned in it. Near Forkheim in Upper Franken, a straw man called the Judas used to be burned in the churchyards on Easter Saturday. The whole village contributed wood to the pyre on which he perished, and the charred sticks were afterward kept and planted in the fields on Walpurgis Day, the 1st of May, to preserve the wheat from blight and mildew. About 100 years ago or more, the custom at Altenburg in Upper Bavaria used to be as follows. On the afternoon of Easter Saturday, the lads collected wood, which they piled in a cornfield, while in the middle of the pile they set up a tall wooden cross, all swathed in straw. After the evening service, they lighted their lanterns at the consecrated candle in the church and ran with them at full speed to the pyre, each striving to get there first. The first to arrive set fire to the heap. No woman or girl might come near the bonfire, but they were allowed to watch it from a distance. As the flames rose, the men and lads rejoiced and made merry, shouting, "We are burning the Judas." The man who had been the first to reach the pyre and to kindle it was rewarded on Easter Sunday by the women, who gave him colored eggs at the church door. The object of the whole ceremony was to keep off the hail. At other villages of Upper Bavaria, the ceremony which took place between 9 and 10 at night on Easter Saturday, was called burning the Easter man. On a hike about a mile from the village, the young fellows set up a tall cross enveloped in straw so that it looked like a man with his arms stretched out. This was the Easter man. No lad under 18 years of age might take part in the ceremony. One of the young men stationed himself beside the Easter man, holding in his hand a consecrated taper which he had brought from the church and lighted. The rest stood at equal intervals in a great circle round the cross. At a given signal, they raced thrice round the circle, and then at a second signal ran straight at the cross and at the lad with the lighted taper beside it. The one who reached the goal first had the right of setting fire to the Easter man. Great was the jubilation while he was burning. When he had been consumed in the flames, 3 lads were chosen from among the rest, and each of the 3 drew a circle on the ground with a stick thrice round the ashes. Then they all left the spot. On Easter Monday, the villagers gathered the ashes and strewed them on the fields. Also, they planted in the fields palm branches, which had been consecrated on Palm Sunday, and sticks which had been charred and hallowed on Good Friday, all for the purpose of protecting their fields against showers of hail. In some parts of Swabia, the Easter fires might not be kindled with iron or steel or flint, but only by the friction of wood. The custom of the Easter fires appears to have prevailed all over central and western Germany from north to south. We find it also in Holland, where the fires were kindled on the highest eminences, and the people danced round them and leaped through the flames or over the glowing embers. Here, too, as often in Germany, the materials for the bonfire were collected by the young folk from door to door. In many parts of Sweden, firearms are discharged in all directions of on Easter Eve, and huge bonfires are lighted on hills and eminences. Some people think that the intention is to keep off the troll and other evil spirits who are especially active at this season. Trying to see if I want to read the Beltane. I know that's mostly for Halloween. Um, okay, we'll just save that for May. So let's see. This book is over 800 something pages, so I'm not going to just read everything in one day. Okay, I'm going to read the need fire. Since we are studying Passover, we have to consider during Passover, there is a sacrifice. There is a temple, there is a tradition that is done. There is an animal. There is a spilling of the blood. There is a fire. There is a burning. So we need to know what all of these things mean. I think that we should all want to know that, considering the fact that you worship a God who considerably needs these things, needs you to get these things done. So the need fire or the fire festivals hitherto described are all celebrated periodically at certain stated times of the year. But besides these regularly recurring celebrations, the peasants in many parts of Europe have been wont from time immemorial to resort to a ritual of fire at irregular intervals in seasons of distress and calamity. above all when their cattle were attacked by epidemic disease. The question you have to ask is, why are they being attacked by epidemic disease? No account of the popular European fire festivals would be complete without some notice of these remarkable rites, which have all the greater claim on our attention because they may perhaps be regarded as the source and origin of all the other fire festivals. Certainly, they must date from a very remote antiquity. The general name by which they are known among the Teutonic peoples is need fire. Sometimes the need fire was known as wildfire, quote unquote, to distinguish it no doubt from the tame fire produced by more ordinary methods. Among Slavonic peoples, it is called living fire. The history of the custom can be traced from the early Middle Ages when it was denounced by the church as a heathen superstition down to the first half of the 19th century, when it was still occasionally practiced in various parts of Germany, England, Scotland, and Ireland. Among Slavonic peoples, it appears to have lingered even longer. The usual occasion for performing the rite was an outbreak of plague or cattle disease, for which the need fire was believed to be an infallible remedy. The animals which were subjected to it included cows, pigs, horses, and sometimes geese. As a necessary preliminary to the kindling of the need fire, all other fires and lights in the neighborhood were extinguished, so that not so much as a spark remained alight. For so long as even a night light burned in a house, it was imagined that the need fire could not kindle. Sometimes it was deemed enough to put out all the fires in the village, but sometimes the extinction extended to neighboring villages or to a whole parish. In some parts of the Highlands of Scotland, the rule was that all householders who dwelt within the two nearest running streams should put out their lights and fires on the day appointed. Usually, the need fire was made in the open air, but in some parts of Serbia, it was kindled in a dark room. Sometimes the place was a crossway or a hollow in a road. In the Highlands of Scotland, the proper places for performing the rite seem to have been knolls or small islands in rivers. The regular method of producing the need fire was by friction or two pieces of wood. It might not be struck by flint and steel. Very exceptionally, among some South Slavs, we read of a practice of kindling a need fire by striking a piece of iron on an anvil. Where the wood to be employed is specific, it is generally said to be oak, but on the lower Rhine, the fire was kindled by the friction of oak wood or fir wood. In Slavonic countries, we hear of poplar, pear, and cornel wood being used for the purpose. Often the material is simply described as two pieces of dry wood. Sometimes 9 different kinds of wood were deemed necessary, but rather perhaps to be burned in the bonfire than to be rubbed together for the production of the need fire. The particular mode of kindling the need fire varied in different districts. A very common was this: 2 poles were driven into the ground about a foot and a half from each other. Each pole had in the side facing the other a socket into which a smooth cross piece or roller was fitted. The sockets were stuffed with linen, and the 2 ends of the roller were rammed tightly into the sockets. To make it more inflammable, the roller was often coated with tar. A rope was then wound round the roller, and the free ends at both sides were gripped by 2 or more persons, who by pulling the rope to and fro caused the roller to revolve rapidly, till through the friction the linen in the sockets took fire. The sparks were immediately caught in tow or oakum and waved about in a circle until they burst into a bright glow, when straw was applied to it and the blazing straw used to kindle the fuel that had been stacked to make the bonfire. Often a wheel, sometimes a cartwheel or even a spinning wheel, formed part of the mechanism. In Aberdeenshire, it was called the muckle wheel. In the island of Mull, the wheel was turned from east to west over 9 spindles of oak wood. Sometimes we are merely told that 2 wooden planks were roped together. Sometimes it was prescribed that the cartwheel used for fire making and the axle on which it turned should both be new. Similarly, it was said that the rope which turned the roller should be new. If possible, it should be woven of strands taken from a gallows rope with which people had been hanged. But this was a counsel of perfection rather than a strict necessity. Various rules were also laid down as to the kind of persons who might or should make the need fire. Sometimes it was said that the two persons who pulled the rope which twirled the roller should always be brothers or at least bear the same baptismal name. Sometimes it was deemed sufficient if they were both chaste young men. In some villages of Brunswick, people thought that if everybody who lent a hand in kindling the need fire did not bear the same Christian name, they would labor in vain. In Cilicia, the tree employed to produce the need fire used to be felled by a pair of twin brothers. In the western islands of Scotland, the fire was kindled by 81 married men who rubbed two great planks against each other, working in relays of 9. In North Uist, the 9 times 9 who made the fire were all first begotten sons, but we are not told whether they were married or single. Among the Serbians, the need fire is sometimes kindled by a boy and girl between 11 and 14 years of age who work stark naked in a dark room. Sometimes it is made by an old man and an old woman, also in a dark room. In Bulgaria, too, the makers of need fire stripped themselves of their clothes. In Kythnos, they divested themselves of all kinds of metal. If after long rubbing of the wood no fire was elicited, they concluded that some fire must still be burning in the village. So a strict search was made from house to house. If any fire that might be found was put out, and the negligent householder punished or upbraided. Indeed, a heavy fine might be inflicted on him. When the need fire was at last kindled, the bonfire was lit from it, and as soon as the blaze had somewhat died down, the sick animals were driven over the glowing embers, sometimes in a regular order of precedence. First the pigs, next the cows, and last of all the horses. Sometimes they were driven twice or thrice through the smoke and flames, so that occasionally some of them were scorched to death. As soon as all the beasts were through, the young folk would rush wildly at the ashes and cinders, sprinkling and blackening each other with them. Those who were most blackened would march in triumph behind the cattle into the village and would not wash themselves for a long time. From the bonfire, people carried live embers home and used them to rekindle the fires in their houses. These brands, after being extinguished in water, they sometimes put in the managers at which the cattle fed, and kept them there for a while. Ashes from the need fire were also strewed on the field to protect the crops against vermin. Sometimes they were taken home to be employed as remedies in sickness, being sprinkled on the ailing part or mixed in water and drunk by the patient. In the western islands of Scotland and on the adjoining mainland, as soon as the fire on the domestic hearth had been rekindled from the need fire, a pot full of water was set on it, and the water thus heated was afterwards sprinkled upon the people infected with the plague, or upon the cattle that were tainted by the murrain. Special virtue was attributed to the smoke of the bonfire. In Sweden, fruit trees and nets were fumigated with it in order that the trees might bear fruit and the nets catch fish. In the Highlands of Scotland, the need fire was accounted a sovereign remedy for witchcraft. In the island of Mull, when the fire was kindled as a cure for the murrain, we hear of the rite being accompanied by the sacrifice of a sick heifer, which was cut in pieces and burnt. Slavonian and Bulgarian peasants conceive cattle plague as a foul thing, a vampire which can be kept at bay by interposing a barrier of fire between it and the herds. A similar conception may perhaps have originally everywhere underlain the use of the need fire as a remedy for the murrain. It appears that in some parts of Germany, the people did not wait for an outbreak of cattle plague, but taking time by the forelock, kindled a need fire annually to prevent the calamity. Similarly, in Poland, the peasants are said to kindle fires in the village streets every year on St. Ruckus's Day and to drive the cattle thrice through them in order to protect the beast against the murrain. We have seen that in the Hebrides, the cattle were in like manner driven annually round that the Beltane fires for the same purpose. In some cantons of Switzerland, children still kindle a need fire by the friction of wood for the sake of dispelling a mist. So the interpretation on the fire festivals in general. The foregoing survey of the popular fire festivals of Europe suggests some general observations. In the first place, we can hardly help being struck by the resemblance which the ceremonies bear to each other, at whatever time of the year and in whatever part of Europe they are celebrated. The custom of kindling great bonfires, leaping over them, and driving cattle through or round them would seem to have been practically universal throughout Europe. And the same may be said of the processions or races with blazing torches in around fields, orchards, pastures, or cattle stalls. Less widespread are the customs of hurling lighted discs into the air and trundling a burning wheel downhill. The ceremonial of the Yule log is distinguished from that of the other fire festivals by the privacy and domesticity which characterize it, but this distinction may well be due simply to the rough weather of midwinter. Okay, we're going to leave that there. So another thing that we're focusing on, if I didn't already say it, is the spring solstice, because around the same time that Passover is being held is also the spring solstice, which is also called the New Year. So we just want to get a good understanding on these things to not incorporate them one into the other. So we have Passover, we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we have first fruits, which leads up to the next feast, which is Pentecost. Okay, so the manner in which the fire appears to have been originally kindled on these occasions has been alleged in support of the view that it was intended to be a mock sun. As some scholars have perceived, it is highly probable that at the periodic festivals in former times, fire was universally obtained by the friction of two pieces of wood. It is still so procured in some places, both at Easter and the midsummer festivals, and it is expressly said to have been formerly so procured at the Beltane celebration, both in Scotland and in Wales. So pure the purificatory theory of the fire festival. So the quote unquote purification of the fire, or the theory of it. So thus far we have considered what may be said for the theory that at the European fire festivals, the fire is kindled as a charm to ensure an abundant supply of sunshine. This is in Europe. So it is to ensure an abundant supply of sunshine for man and beast, for corn and fruits. It remains to consider what may be said against this theory and in favor of the view that in these rites, fire is employed not as a creative, but as a cleansing agent which purifies men, animals, and plants by burning up and consuming the noxious elements, whether material or spiritual, which menace all living things with disease and death. So, first, then, it is to be observed that the people who practice the fire customs appear never to allege the solar theory in explanation of them, while on the contrary, they do frequently and emphatically put forward the purificatory theory. This is a strong argument in favor of the purificatory and against the solar theory. For the popular explanation of a popular custom is never to be rejected except for grave cause. And in the present case, there seems to be no adequate reason for rejecting it. The conception of fire as a destructive agent, which can be turned to account for the consumption of evil things, is so simple and obvious that it could hardly escape the minds even of the rude peasantry with whom these festivals originated. On the other hand, the conception of fire as an emanation of the sun, or at all events as linked to it by a bond of physical sympathy, is far less simple and obvious. And though the use of fire as a charm to produce sunshine appears to be undeniable, nevertheless, in attempting to explain popular customs, we should never have recourse to a more recondite idea when a simpler one lies to hand and is supported by the explicit testimony of the people themselves. Now, in the case of the fire festivals, the destructive aspect of fire is one upon which the people dwell again and again. And it is highly significant that the great evil against which the fire is directed appears to be witchcraft. Again and again, we are told that the fires are intended to burn or repel witches. And the intention is sometimes graphically expressed by burning an effigy of a witch in the fire. Hence, when we remember the great hold which the dread of witchcraft has had on the popular European mind in all ages, we may suspect that the primary intention of all these fire festivals was simply to destroy, or at all agents, get rid of the witches who were regarded as the causes of nearly all the misfortunes and calamities that befall men, their cattle, and their crops. We'll talk about that later. So this suspicion is confirmed when we examine the evils for which the bonfires and torches were supposed to provide a remedy. Foremost, perhaps among these evils, we may reckon the diseases of cattle. And of the ills that witches are believed to work, there is probably none which is so constantly insisted on as the harm they do to the herds, particularly by stealing the milk from the cows. Now it is significant that the need fire, which may perhaps be regarded as the parent of the periodic fire festivals, is kindled above all as a remedy for a murrain or other disease of cattle. And the circumstance suggests what on general grounds seems probable, that the custom of kindling the need fire goes back to a time when the ancestors of the European peoples subsisted chiefly on the products of their herds, and when agriculture as yet played a subordinate part in their lives. Witches and wolves are the two great foes still dreaded by the herdsmen in many parts of Europe, and we need not wonder that he should resort to fire as a powerful means of banning them both. Among Slavonic peoples, it appears that the foes whom the need fire is designed to combat are not so much living witches as vampires and other evil spirits, and the ceremony aims rather at repelling these baleful beings than at actually consuming them in the flames. But for our present purpose, these distinctions are immaterial. The important thing to observe is that among Slavs, the need fire, which is probably the original of all the ceremonial fires now under consideration, is not a sun charm, but clearly and unmistakably nothing but a means of protecting man and beast against the attacks of maleficent creatures whom the peasant thinks to burn or scare by the heat of fire, just as he might burn or scare wild animals. Again, the bonfires are supposed to protect the fields against hail and the homestead against thunder and lightning. But both hail and thunderstorms are frequently thought to be caused by witches. Hence, the fire which bans the witches necessarily serves at the same time as a talisman against hail, thunder, and lightning. Further, brands taken from the bonfires are commonly kept in the houses to guard them against the conflagration. And through this, and though this may perhaps be done on the principle of homeopathic magic, one fire being thought to act as a preventive of another, it is also possible that the intention may be kept witch incendiaries at bay. Again, people leap over the bonfires as a preventive of colic and look at the flames steadily in order to preserve their eyes in good health. And both colic and sore eyes are in Germany and probably elsewhere set down to the machinations of witches. Once more, to leap over the midsummer fires or to circumambulate them is thought to prevent a person from feeling pains in his back at reaping. And in Germany, such pains are called witch shots and ascribed to witchcraft. Okay, so as we know in the Bible, um, previously or prior to the Exodus, or during the time of Abraham, they were sacrificing humans. They were sacrificing children and, and just everything. So this is about the burning of human beings in the fires. So the burning of effigies in the fires. We still have to ask, what is the meaning of burning effigies in the fire at these festivals? After the preceding investigation, the answer to the question seems obvious, as the fires are often alleged to be kindled for the purpose of burning the witches. And as the effigy burnt in them is sometimes called the witch, quote unquote, we might naturally be disposed to conclude that all the effigies consumed in the flames on these occasions represent witches or warlocks, and that the custom of burning them is merely a substitute for burning the wicked men and women themselves, since on the principle of the homeopathic or imitative magic, you practically destroy the witch herself in destroying her effigy. On the whole, this explanation of the burning of straw figures in human shape at the festivals is perhaps the most probable. Yet it may be that this explanation does not apply to all the cases, and that certain of them may admit and even require another interpretation. For the effigies so burned, as I have already remarked, can hardly be separated from the effigies of death, which are burned or otherwise destroyed in spring. And grounds have been already given for regarding the so-called effigies of death as really representatives of the tree spirit or spirit of vegetation. Are the other effigies which are burned in the spring and midsummer bonfires susceptible of the same explanation? It would seem so. For just as the fragments of the so-called death are struck in the fields to make the crops grow, so the charred embers of the figure burned in the spring bonfires are sometimes laid on the fields in the belief that they will keep vermin from the crop. Again, the rule that the last married bride must leap over the fire in which the straw man is burned on Shrove Tuesday is probably intended to make her fruitful. But as we have seen, the power of blessing women with offspring is a special attribute of tree spirits. It is therefore a fair presumption that the burning effigy over which the bride must leap is a representative of the fertilizing tree spirit or spirit of vegetation. This character of the effigy as representative of the spirit of vegetation is almost unmistakable when the figure is composed of an unthreshed sheaf of corn or is covered from head to foot with flowers. Again, it is to be noted that instead of a puppet, trees, either living or felled, are sometimes burned both in the spring and midsummer bonfires. Now, considering the frequency with which the tree spirit is represented in human shape, it is hardly rash to suppose that when sometimes a tree and sometimes an effigy is burned in these fires, the effigy and the tree are regarded as equivalent to each other, each being a representative of the tree spirit. This again is confirmed by observing first that sometimes the effigy which is to be burned is carried about simultaneously with a May tree, the former being carried by the boys, the latter by the girls, and second, that the effigy is sometimes tied to a living tree and burned with it. In these cases, we can scarcely doubt the tree spirit is represented, as we have found it represented before, in duplicate, both by the tree and by the effigy. That the true character of the effigy as a representative of the beneficent spirit of vegetation should sometimes be forgotten is natural. The custom of burning a beneficent god is too foreign to later modes of thought to escape misinterpretation. Naturally enough, the people who continued to burn his image came in time to identify it as the effigy of persons whom, on various grounds, they regarded with aversion, such as Judas Iscariot, Luther, and a witch. The general reasons for killing a god or his representative must have been examined in a preceding chapter. But when the god happens to be a deity of vegetation, there are special reasons why he should die by fire. So I'm going to stop right here on page 747 and come back. And we're going to go read about eating the gods. Come on. One more second. Okay, so eating the God, and this is the sacrament of first fruits. So we have now seen that the corn spirit is represented sometimes in human, sometimes in animal form, and that in both cases he is killed in the person of his representative and eaten sacramentally. To find examples of actually killing the human representative of the corn spirit, we had naturally to go to savage races. But the harvest suppers of our European peasants have furnished unmistakable examples of the sacramental eating of animals as representatives of the corn spirit. But further, as we might have been anticipated, the new corn is itself eaten sacramentally, that is, as the body of the corn spirit. In Wormland, Sweden, the farmer's wife uses the grain of the last sheaf to bake a loaf in the shape of a little girl. This loaf is divided amongst the whole household and eaten by them. Here, the loaf represents the corn spirit conceived as a maiden. Just as in Scotland, the corn spirit is similarly conceived and represented by the last sheaf made up in the form of a woman and bearing the name of the maiden. As usual, the corn spirit is believed to reside in the last sheaf, and to eat a loaf made from the last sheaf is therefore to eat the corn spirit itself. Similarly, at La Palisse in France, a man made of dough is hung upon the fir tree, which is carried on the last harvest wagon. The tree and the dough man are taken to the mayor's house and kept there till the vintage is over. Then the close of the harvest is celebrated by a feast at which the mayor breaks the dough man in pieces and gives the pieces to the people to eat. In these examples, the corn spirit is represented and eaten in human shape. In other cases, though the new corn is not baked in loaves of human shape, still the solemn ceremonies with which it is eaten suffice to indicate that it is partaken of sacramentally, that is, as the body of the corn spirit. For example, the following ceremonies used to be observed by Lithuanian peasants at eating the new corn. About the time of the autumn sowing, when all the corn had been got and the threshing had begun, each farmer held a festival called Sabarios, that is the mixing or throwing together. He took 9 good handfuls of each kind of crop: wheat, barley, oats, flax, beans, lentils, and the rest, and each handful he divided into 3 parts. The 27 portions of each grain were then thrown on a heap and all mixed up together. The grain used had to be that which was first threshed and winnowed, and which had been set aside and kept for this purpose. A part of the grain thus mixed was employed to bake little loaves, one for each of the household. The rest was mixed with more barley or oats and made into beer. The first beer brewed from this mixture was for the drinking of the farmer, his wife, and children. The second brew was for the servants. The beer being ready, the farmer chose an evening when no stranger was expected. Then he knelt down before the barrel of beer, drew a jug full of the liquor, and poured it on the bung of the barrel, saying, "O fruitful earth, make rye and barley and all kinds of corn to flourish." Next, he took the jug to the parlor where his wife and children awaited him. On the floor of the parlor lay bound a black or white or speckled, not a red, cock and a hen of the same color and of the same brood, which must have been hatched within the year. Then the farmer knelt down with the jug in his hand and thanked God for the harvest and prayed for a good crop next year. Next, all lifted up their hands and said, "O God, and thou, O earth, we give you this cock and hen as a free will offering." With that, the farmer killed the fowls with the blows of a wooden spoon, for he might not cut their heads off. After the first prayer and after killing each of the birds, he poured out a third of the beer. Then his wife boiled the fowls in a new pot which had never been used before. After that, a bushel was set bottom upwards on the floor, and on it were placed the little loaves mentioned above and the boiled fowls. Next, the new beer was fetched, together with a ladle and 3 mugs, none of which were used except on this occasion. When the farmer had ladled the beer into the mugs, the family knelt down round the bushel. The father then uttered a prayer and drank off the 3 mugs of beer. The rest followed his example. Then the loaves and the flesh of the fowls were eaten, after which the beer went round again, till everyone had emptied each of the 3 mugs 9 times. None of the food should remain over, but if anything did happen to be left, it was consumed next morning with the same ceremonies. The bones were given to the dog to eat. If he did not eat them all, the remains were buried under the dung in the cattle stall. This ceremony was observed at the beginning of December. On the day on which it took place, no bad word might be spoken. Such was the custom about 200 years or more ago at the present day in Lithuania. When new potatoes or loaves made from the new corn are being eaten, all the people at table pulled each other's hair. The meaning of this last custom is obscure, but a similar custom was certainly observed by the heathen Lithuanians at their solemn sacrifices. Many of the Estonians of the island of Ocel will not eat bread baked of the new corn till they have first taken a bite at a piece of iron. The iron is here plainly a charm intended to render harmless the spirit that is in the corn. In Sutherlandshire at the present day, when the new potatoes are dug, all the family must taste them. Otherwise, the spirits in them, the potatoes, take offense, and the potatoes would not keep. In one part of Yorkshire, it is still customary for the clergyman to cut the first corn, and my informant believes that the corn so cut is used to make the communion bread. If the latter part of the custom is correctly reported, and analogy is all in its favor, it shows how the Christian communion has absorbed within itself a sacrament which is doubtless far older than Christianity. The Aino or Ainu of Japan are said to distinguish various kinds of millet as male and female, respectively, and these kinds, taken together, are called the divine husband and wife cereal, Yumeric Haru Kamuai. Therefore, before millet is pounded and made into cakes for general eating, the old men have a few made for themselves first to worship. When they are ready, they pray to them very earnestly and say, O thou cereal deity, we worship thee. Thou hast grown very well this year, and thy flavor will be sweet. Thou art good. The goddess of fire will be glad, and we also shall rejoice gladly. O thou God, O thou divine cereal, do thou nourish the people. I now partake of thee. I worship thee and give thee thanks. After having thus prayed, they, the worshippers, take a cake and eat it. And from this time, the people may all partake of the new millet. And so, with many gestures of homage and words of prayer, this kind of food is dedicated to the well being of the Ainu. No doubt the cereal offering is regarded as a tribute paid to a god, but that god is no other than the seed itself, and it is only a god insofar as it is beneficial to the human body. At the close of the rice harvest in the East Indian island of Peru, each clan meets at a common sacramental meal to which every member of the clan is bound to contribute a little of the new rice. This meal is called eating the soul of the rice, a name which clearly indicates the sacramental character of the repast. Some of the rice is also set apart and offered to the spirits. Amongst the Alfors in Manasa and Celebes, the priest sows the first rice seed and plucks the first ripe rice in each field. This rice he roasts and grinds into meal and gives some of it to each of the household. Shortly before the rice harvest in Bolan Mangando, another district of Celebes, An offering is made of a small pig or a fowl. Then the priest plucks a little rice, first on his own field and next on those of his neighbors. All the rice thus plucked by him he dries along with his own, and then gives it back to the respective owners who have it ground and boiled. When it is boiled, the women take it back with an egg to the priest, who offers the egg in sacrifice and returns the rice to the women. Of this rice, every member of the family, down to the youngest child, must partake. After this ceremony, everyone is free to get in his rice. Amongst the Burghers or Badagas, a tribe of the Nilgiri Hills in southern India, the first handful of seed is sown and the first sheaf reaped by a Kurumber, a man of a different tribe, the members of which the Burghers regard as sorcerers. The grain contained in the first sheaf is that day reduced to meal, made into cakes, and being offered as a first fruit oblation is, together with the remainder of the sacrificed animal, partaken of by the burgher and the whole of his family, as the meat of a federal offering and sacrifice. Among the Hindus of southern India, the eating of the new rice is the occasion of a family festival called Pongal. The new rice is boiled in a new pot on a fire which is kindled at noon on the day when, according to Hindu astrologers, the sun enters the Tropic of Capricorn. The boiling of the pot is watched with great anxiety by the whole family, for as the milk boils, so will the coming year be. If the milk boils rapidly, the year will be prosperous, but it will be the reverse if the milk boils slowly. Some of the new boiled rice is offered to the image of Ganesha. Then everyone partakes of it. In some parts of northern India, the festival of the new crop is known as Navan, that is new grain. When the crop is ripe, the owner takes the almonds, goes to the fields, plucks 5 or 6 ears of barley in the spring crop and one of the millets in the autumn harvest. This is brought home, parched, and mixed with coarse sugar, butter, and curds. Some of it is thrown on the fire in the name of the village gods and deceased ancestors. The rest is eaten by the family. The ceremony of eating the new yams at Onitsha on the Niger is thus described. Each headman brought out 6 yams and cut down young branches of palm leaves and placed them before his gate. Roasted 3 of the yams and got some kola nuts and fish. After the yam is roasted, the Libya or country doctor takes the yam, scrapes it into a sort of meal, and divides it into halves. He then takes one piece and places it on the lips of the person who is going to eat the new yam. The eater then blows up the steam from the hot yam and afterwards pokes the hole into his mouth and says, I thank God for being permitted to eat the new yam. He then begins to chew it heartily with fish likewise. Among the Nandi of British East Africa, when the Eleusine grain is ripening in autumn, every woman who owns a cornfield goes out into it with her daughters, and they all pluck some of the ripe grain. Each of the women then fixes one grain in her necklace and chews another, which she rubs on her forehead, throat, and breast. No mark of joy escapes them. Sorrowfully, they cut a basket full of the new corn and carrying it home, place it in the loft to dry. As the ceiling is of wicker work, a good deal of the grain drops through the crevices and falls into the fire, where it explodes with a crackling noise. The people make no attempt to prevent this waste, for they regard the crackling of the grain in the fire as a sign that the souls of the dead are partaking of it. A few days later, porridge is made from the new grain and served up with milk at the evening meal. All the members of the family take some of the porridge and dab it on the walls and roofs of the huts. Also, they put a little in their mouths and spit it out towards the east and on the outside of the huts. Then, holding up some of the grain in his hand, the head of the family prays to God for health and strength, and likewise for milk and everybody present repeats the words of the prayer after him. Amongst the Caffres of Natal and Zululand, no one may eat of the new fruits till after a festival which marks the beginning of the Caffre year and falls at the end of December or the beginning of January. All the people assemble at the king's kraal, where they feast and dance. Before they separate, the dedication of the people takes place. Various fruits of the earth, as corn, mealies, and pumpkins, mixed with the flesh of a sacrificed animal and with medicine, quote unquote, are boiled in great pots, and a little of this food is placed in each man's mouth by the king himself. After thus partaking of the sanctified fruits, a man is himself sanctified for the whole year and may immediately get in his crops. It is believed that if any man were to partake of the new fruits before the festival, he would die. If he were detected, he would be put to death, or at least all his cattle would be taken from him. The holiness of the new fruits is well marked by the rule that they must be cooked in a special pot which is used only for this purpose, and on a new fire kindled by a magician through the friction of two sticks, which are called husband and wife. Among the Bucanas, it is a rule that before they partake of the new crops, they must purify themselves. The purification takes place at the commencement of the new year on a day in January, which is fixed by the chief. It begins in the great kraal of the tribe where all the adult males assemble. Each of them takes in his hand leaves of a gourd called the natives larotes, described as something between a pumpkin and a vegetable marrow. And having crushed the leaves, he anoints with the express juice his big toes and his navel. Many people indeed apply the juice to all the joints of their body, but the better informed say that this is a vulgar departure from ancient custom. After this ceremony in the great kraal, every man goes home to his own kraal, assembles all the members of his family, men, women, and children, and smears them all with the juice of the larote's leaves. Some of the leaves are also pounded, mixed up with milk in a large wooden dish, and given to the dogs to lap up. Then the porridge plate of each member of the family is rubbed with the larote's leaves. When this purification has been completed, but not before, people are free to eat of the new crops. The Bororo Indians of Brazil think that it would be certain death to eat the new maize before it has been blessed by the medicine man. The ceremony of blessing it is as follows. The half-ripe husk is washed and placed before the medicine man, who by dancing and singing for several hours and by incessant smoking works himself up into a state of ecstasy, whereupon he bites into the husk, trembling in every limb and uttering shrieks from time to time. A similar ceremony is performed whenever a large animal or a large fish is killed. The Bororo are firmly persuaded that were any man to touch unconsecrated maize or meat before the ceremony had been completed, he and his whole tribe would perish. Amongst the Creek Indians of North America, the busk or festival of first fruits was the chief ceremony of the year. It was held in July or August when the corn was ripe and marked the end of the old year and the beginning of the new one. Before it took place, none of the Indians would eat or even handle any part of the new harvest. Sometimes each town had its own busk. Sometimes several towns united to hold one in common. Before the celebrating the busk, the people provided themselves with new clothes and new household utensils and furniture. They collected their old clothes and rubbish, together with all the remaining grain and other old provisions, cast them together in one common heap, and consumed them with fire. As a preparation for the ceremony, all the fires in the village were extinguished and the ashes swept clean away. In particular, the hearth or altar of the temple was dug up and the ashes carried out. Then the chief priest put some roots on the bottom snake plant with some green tobacco leaves and a little of the new fruits at the bottom of the fireplace. which he afterwards commanded to be covered up with white clay and wetted over with clean water. A thick arbor of green branches of young trees was then made over the altar. Meanwhile, the women at home were cleaning out their houses, renewing the old hearths, and scouring all the cooking vessels that they might be ready to receive the new fire and the new fruits. The public or sacred square was carefully swept of even the smallest crumbs of previous feasts, for fear of polluting the first fruit offerings. Also, every vessel that had contained or had been used about any food during the expiring year was removed from the temple before sunset. Mm. Then all the men who were not known to have violated the law of the first fruit offering and that of marriage during the year were summoned by a crier to enter the holy square and observe a solemn fast. But the women, except 6 old ones, the children, and all who had not attained the rank of warriors, were forbidden to enter the square. Sentinels were also posted at the corners of the square to keep out all persons deemed impure and all animals. A strict fast was then observed for 2 nights and a day, the devotees drinking a bitter decoction of butter snake root in order to vomit and purge their sinful bodies, that the people outside the square might also be purified. One of the old men laid down a quantity of green tobacco at a corner of the square. This was carried off by an old woman and distributed to the people without, who chewed and swallowed it in order to afflict their souls. During this general fast, the women, children, and men of weak constitution were allowed to eat after midday, but not before. On the morning when the fast ended, the women brought a quantity of the old year's food to the outside of the sacred square. These provisions were then fetched in and set before the famished multitude, but all traces of them had to be removed before noon. When the sun was declining from the meridian, all the people were commanded by the voice of the crier to stay within doors, to do no bad act, and to be sure to extinguish and throw away every spark of the old fire. Universal silence now reigned. Then the high priest made the new fire by the friction of 2 pieces of wood and placed it on the altar under the green arbor. This new fire was believed to atone for all past crimes except murder. Next, a basket of new fruits was brought. The high priest took out a little of each sort of fruit, rubbed it with bear's oil, and offered it, together with some flesh, to the bountiful Holy Spirit of fire as a first fruit offering and an annual oblation for sin. He also consecrated the sacred emetics, the button snake root, and the casina or black drink by pouring a little of them into the fire. The persons who had remained outside now approached without entering the sacred square, and the chief priest thereupon made a speech, exhorting the people to observe their old rites and customs, announcing that the new divine fire had purged away the sins of the past year, and earnestly warning the women that if any of them had not extinguished the old fire or had contracted any impurity, they must forthwith depart, lest the divine fire should spoil both them and the people. Some of the new fire was then set down outside the holy square. The women carried it home joyfully and laid it on their unpolluted hearths. When several towns had united to celebrate the festival, the new fire might thus be carried for several miles. The new fruits were then dressed on the new fires and eaten with bear's oil, which was deemed indispensable. At one point of the festival, the men rubbed the new corn between their hands, then on their faces and breasts. During the festival which followed, the warriors, dressed in their wild martial array, their heads covered with white down and carrying white feathers in their hands, danced round the sacred arbor. Always losing my spot. Okay. Under which burned the new fire. The ceremonies lasted 8 days, during which the strictest continuous was practiced. Towards the conclusion of the festival, the warriors fought a mock battle. Then the men and women together in three circles danced round the sacred fire. Lastly, all the people smeared themselves with white clay and bathed in running water. They came out of the water believing that no evil could now befall them for what they had done amiss in the past. So they departed in joy and peace. To this day, also, the remnant of the Seminole Indians of Florida, a people of the same stock as the Creeks, hold an annual purification and festival called the Green Corn Dance, at which the new corn is eaten. On the evening of the first day of the festival, they quaff a nauseous black drink, as it is called, which acts both as an emetic and a purgative. They believe that he who does not drink of this liquor cannot safely eat the new green corn, and besides that, he will be sick at some time in the year. While the liquor is being drunk, the dancing begins, and the medicine men join in it. Next day, they eat of the green corn. The following day, they fast, probably from fear of polluting the sacred food in their stomachs by contact with common food. But the third day, they hold a great feast. Even tribes which do not till the ground sometimes observe analogous ceremonies when they gather the first wild fruits or dig the first roots of the season. Thus, among the Salish and Tenna Indians of Northwest America, before the young people eat the first berries or roots of the season, they always address the fruit or plant and beg for its favor and aid. In some tribes, regular first fruit ceremonies were annually held at the time of picking the wild fruit or gathering the roots, and also among the salmon eating tribes when the run of the sockeye salmon began. These ceremonies were not so much thanksgivings as performances to ensure a plentiful crop or supply of the particular object desired. For if they were not properly and reverently carried out, there was danger of giving offense to the spirits of the objects and being deprived of them. For example, these Indians are fond of the young shoots or suckers of the wild raspberry, and they observe a solemn ceremony at eating the first of them in season. The shoots are cooked in a new pot. The people assemble and stand in a great circle with closed eyes, while the presiding chief or medicine man invokes the spirit of the plant, begging that it will be propitious to them and grant them a good supply of suckers. After this part of the ceremony is over, the cooked suckers are handed to the presiding officer in a newly carved dish, and a small portion is given to each person present, who reverently and decorously eats it. The Thompson Indians of British Columbia cook and eat the sunflower root, but they used to regard it as a mysterious being and observed a number of taboos in connection with it. For example, women who were engaged in digging or cooking the root must practice continence, and no man might come near the oven where the women were baking the root. When young people ate the first berries, roots, or other products of the season, they addressed a prayer to the sunflower root as follows: I inform thee that I intend to eat thee. Mayest thou always help me to ascend, so that I may always be able to reach the tops of mountains, and I may never be clumsy. I ask this from thee, sunflower root. Thou art the greatest of all in mystery. To omit this prayer would make the eater lazy and cause him to sleep long in the morning. These customs of the Thompson and other Indian tribes of Northwest America are instructive because they clearly indicate the motive, or at least one of the motives, which underlies the ceremonies observed at eating the first fruits of the season. That motive indicates of these Indians is simply a belief that the plant itself is animated by a conscience and more or less powerful spirit who must be propitiated before the people can safely partake of the fruits or roots which are supposed to be part of his body. Now, if this is true of wild fruits and roots, we may infer with some probability that it is also true of cultivated fruits and roots, such as yams, and in particular, that it holds good of the cereals, such as wheat, barley, oats, rice, and maize. In all cases, it seems reasonable to infer that the scruples which savages manifest at eating the first fruits of any crop, and the ceremonies which they observe before they overcome their scruples, are due at least in large measure to a notion that the plant or tree is animated by a spirit or even a deity whose leave must be obtained or whose favor must be sought before it is possible to partake with safety of the new crop. This indeed is plainly affirmed of the Aino. They call the millet the divine cereal, the cereal deity, and they pray to and worship him before they will eat of the cakes made from the new millet. And even where the indwelling divinity of the first fruits is not expressly affirmed, it appears to be implied both by the solemn preparations made for eating them and by the danger supposed to be incurred by persons who venture to partake of them without observing the prescribed ritual. In all such cases, accordingly, we may not improperly describe the eating of the new fruits as a sacrament of communion with the deity, or at all events with a powerful spirit. Among the usage which point to this conclusion are the custom of employing either new or specially reserved vessels to hold the new fruits, and the practice of purifying the persons of the communicants before it is lawful to engage in the solemn act of communion with the divinity. Of all the modes of purification adopted on these occasions, none perhaps brings out the sacramental virtue of the rite so clearly as the Creek and Seminole practice of taking a purgative before swallowing new corn. The intention is thereby to prevent the sacred food from being polluted by contact with common food in the stomach of the eater. For the same reason, Catholics partake of the Eucharist fasting. And among the pastoral Maasai of Eastern Africa, the young warriors who live on meat and milk exclusively are obliged to eat nothing but milk for so many days and then nothing but meat for so many more, and before they pass from the one food to the other, they must make sure that none of the old food remains in their stomachs. This they do by swallowing a very powerful purgative and emetic. In some of the festivals which we have examined, the sacrament of the first fruits is combined with the sacrifice or presentation of them to gods or spirits. And in course of time, the sacrifice of first fruits tend to throw the sacrament into the shade, if not to supersede it. The mere fact of offering the first fruits to the gods or spirits comes now to be thought a sufficient preparation for eating the new corn. The higher powers having received their share, man is free to enjoy the rest. This mode of viewing the new fruits implies that they are regarded no longer as themselves instinct with divine life, but merely as a gift bestowed by the gods upon man, who is bound to express his gratitude and homage to his divine benefactors by returning them a portion of their bounty. Two, eating the god among the Aztecs. The custom of eating bread sacramentally as the body of a god was practiced by the Aztecs before the discovery and conquest of Mexico by the Spaniards. Twice a year in May and December, An image of the great Mexican god Huitzilopochtli or Huitzilopochtli was made of dough, then broken in pieces and solemnly eaten by his worshippers. The May ceremony is thus described by the historian Acosta. The Mexicans in the month of May made their principal feast to their god, and 2 days before this feast, the virgins whereof I have spoken, the which were shut up and secluded in the same temple, and were, as it were, religious women, did mingle a quantity of the seed of beets with roasted maize, and then they did mold it with honey, making an idol of that paste in bigness like to that of wood, putting instead of eyes grains of green glass, of blue or white, and for teeth grains of maize, set forth with all the ornament and furniture that I have said. This being finished, all the noblemen came and brought it in an exquisite and rich garment, like unto that of the idol, wherewith they did attire it. Being thus clad and decked, they did set it in an azure chair and in a litter to carry it on their shoulders. The morning of this feast being come, an hour before day, all the maidens came forth attired in white, with new ornaments, the which that day were called the sisters of their god, Vitzel Iputzli. They came crowned with garlands of maize, roasted and parched, being like unto azahar, or the flower of orange, and about their necks they had great chains of the same, which went baldric wise under their left arm. Their cheeks were dyed with vermilion, their arms from the elbow to the wrist were covered with red parrots' feathers. Young men dressed in red robes and crowned like the virgins with maize, then carried the idol in its litter to the foot of the great pyramid-shaped temple, up the steep and narrow steps of which it was drawn to the music of flutes, trumpets, cornets, and drums. While they mounted up the idol, all the people stood in the court with much reverence and fear. Being mounted to the top, and that they had placed it in a little lodge of roses which they held ready, presently came the young men, which strewed many flowers of sundry kinds, wherewith they filled the temple both within and without. This done, all the virgins came out of their convent, bringing pieces of paste compounded of beets and roasted maize, which was of the same paste whereof the idol was made and compounded, and they were of the fashion of great bones. They delivered them to the young men, who carried them up and laid them at the idol's feet, wherewith they filled the whole place, that it could receive no more. They called these morsels of paste the flesh and bones of Huitzilopochtli. Having laid abroad these bones, presently came all the ancients of the temple, priests, Levites, and all the rest of the ministers, according to their dignities and antiquities. For herein there was a strict order amongst them, one after another, with their veils of diverse colors and works, every one according to his dignity and office, having garlands upon their heads and chains of flowers about their necks. After them came their gods and goddesses, whom they worshipped, of diverse figures, attired in the same livery, then putting themselves in order about those morsels and pieces of paste. They used certain ceremonies with singing and dancing, by means whereof they were blessed and consecrated for the flesh and bones of this idol. This ceremony and blessing whereby they were taken for the flesh and bones of the idol being ended, they honored those pieces in the same sort as their God. All the city came to this goodly spectacle, and there was a commandment very strictly observed throughout all the land, that the day of the feast of the idol Huitzilopochtli, they should eat no other meat but this paste with honey, whereof the idol was made. And this should be eaten at the point of day, and they should drink no water nor any other thing till afternoon. They held it for an ill sign, yea, for sacrilege to do the contrary. But after the ceremonies ended, it was lawful for them to eat anything. During the time of this ceremony, they hid the water from their little children, admonishing all such as had the use of reason not to drink any water, which, if they did, the anger of God would come upon them and they should die, which they did observe very carefully and strictly. The ceremonies, dancing, and sacrifice ended, the went to unclothe themselves, and the priests and superiors of the temple took the idol of paste, which they spoiled of all the ornaments it had, and made many pieces, as well of the idol itself as of the truncheons which they consecrated, and then they gave them to the people in manner of a communion, beginning with the greater and continuing unto the rest, both men, women, and little children, who received it with such tears, fear, and reverence, as it was an admirable thing, saying that they did eat the flesh and bones of God, wherewith they were grieved, such as had any sick folks demanded thereof for them, and carried it with great reverence and veneration. From this interesting passage, we learn that the ancient Mexicans, even before the arrival of Christian missionaries, were fully acquainted with the doctrine of transubstantiation and acted upon it in the solemn rites of their religion. They believed that by consecrating bread, their priests could turn it into the very body of their God, so that all who thereupon partook of the consecrated bread entered into a mystic communion with the deity by receiving a portion of his divine substance into themselves. The doctrine of transubstantiation, or the magical conversion of bread into flesh, was also familiar to the Aryans of ancient India long before the spread and even the rise of Christianity. The Brahmins taught that the rice cakes offered in sacrifice were substitutes for human beings, and that they were actually converted into the real bodies of men by the manipulation of the priests. We read that when the rice cake, still consists of rice meal, it is the hair. When he pours water on it, it becomes skin. When he mixes it, it becomes flesh, for then it becomes consistent, and consistent also is the flesh. When it is baked, it becomes bone, for then it becomes somewhat hard, and hard is the bone. And when he is about to take it off the fire and sprinkles it with butter, he changes it into marrow. This is the completeness which they call the fivefold animal sacrifice. Now, too, we can perfectly understand why, on the day of their solemn communion with the deity, the Mexicans refused to eat any other food than the consecrated bread, which they revered as the very flesh and bones of their God, and why up till noon they might drink nothing at all, not even water. They feared, no doubt, to defile the portion of God in their stomachs by contact with common things. A similar pious fear led the Creek and Seminole Indians, as we saw, to adopt the more thoroughgoing expedient of rinsing out their bodies by a strong purgative before they dared to partake of the sacrament of first fruits. At the festival of the winter solstice in December, the Aztecs killed their god in effigy first and ate him afterwards. As a preparation for this solemn ceremony, an image of the deity in the likeness of a man was fashioned out of seeds of various sorts. Let's look this guy up. And I'll just leave that right there. So, as a preparation for this solemn ceremony, an image of the deity in the likeness of a man was fashioned out of seeds of various sorts. Maybe like this. Um, which were kneaded into a dough with the blood of children. Wow. The bones of the god were represented by pieces of acacia wood. This image was placed on the chief altar of the temple, and on the day of the festival, the king offered incense to it. Early next day, it was taken down and set on its feet in a great hall. Then a priest, who bore the name and acted the part of the god Quetzalcoatl, took a flint tipped dart and hurled it into the breast of the dough image, piercing it through and through. This was called killing the god Hotzul Opotli, so that his body might be eaten. One of the priests cut out the heart of the image and gave it to the king to eat. The rest of the image was divided into minute pieces, of which every man, great and small, down to the male children in the cradle, received one to eat. But no woman might taste a morsel. No, not one. The ceremony was called Teo Qualo or Quelo, that is, God is eaten. That is horrible. And you can just look at the similarities here. Um, so, at another festival, the Mexicans made little images like men, which stood for the cloud capped mountains. These images were molded of a paste of various seeds and were dressed in paper ornaments. Some people fashioned 5, others 10, others as many as 15 of them. Having been made, they were placed in the oratory of each house and worshipped. 4 times in the course of the night, offerings of food were brought to them in tiny vessels, and people sang and played the flute before them through all the hours of darkness. At break of day, the priest stabbed the images with a weaver's instrument, cut off their heads, and tore out their hearts, which they presented to the master of the house on a green saucer. The bodies of the images were then eaten by all the family, especially by the servants, in order that by eating them they might be preserved from certain distempers to which those persons who were negligent of worship to those deities conceived themselves to be subject. So many Manai, Manii, at Aricia. So we are now able to suggest an explanation of the proverb. There are many mani or manai at Aricia. Certain loaves made in the shape of men were called by the Romans manai or manai. Mani. And it appears that this kind of loaf was especially made at Eritrea. Now, mania, the name of one of these loaves, was also the name of the mother or grandmother of ghosts to whom woolen effigies of men and women were dedicated at the festival of the Compitalia. The effigies were hung at the doors of all the houses in Rome. One effigy was hung up for every free person in the house, and one effigy of a different kind for every slave. The reason was that on this day, the ghosts of the dead were believed to be going about, and it was hoped that either out of good nature or through simple inadvertence, they would carry off the effigies at the door instead of the living people in the house. According to tradition, these woolen figures were substitutes for a former custom of sacrificing human beings. Upon data so fragmentary and uncertain, it is impossible to build with confidence, but it seems worth suggesting that the loaves in human form, which appear to have been baked at Eritrea, were sacramental bread. And that in the old days, oh, hot cross buns. Duh. In the old days, when the divine king of the wood was annually slain, loaves were made in his image, like the paste figures of the gods in Mexico, and were eaten sacramentally by his worshippers. The Mexican sacraments in honor of Huitzilopachli were also accompanied by the sacrifice of human victims. The tradition that the founder of the sacred grove at Eritrea was a man named Manius, from whom many Mani were descended, would thus be etymological myth invented to explain the name Mane as applied to these sacramental loaves. A dim recollection of the original connection of the loaves with human sacrifices may perhaps be traced in the story that the effigies dedicated to Mania at the Compitalia were substitutes for human victims. The story itself, however, is probably devoid of foundation, since the practice of putting up dummies to divert the attention of ghosts or demons from living people is not uncommon. For example, the Tibetans stand in fear of innumerable earth demons, all of whom are under the authority of Old Mother Konma. This goddess, who may be compared to the Roman Mania, the mother or grandmother of ghosts, is dressed in golden yellow robes, holds a golden noose in her hand, and rides on a ram. In in order to bar the dwelling house against the foul fiends of whom old Mother Conma is mistress, an elaborate structure somewhat resembling a chandelier is fixed above the door on the outside of the house. It contains a ram skull, a variety of precious objects such as gold leaf, silver, and turquoise, also some dried food such as rice, wheat, and pulse, and finally images or pictures of a man, a woman, and a house. The object of these figures of a man, wife, and house is to deceive the demons should they still come in spite of this offering, and to mislead them into the belief that the foregoing pictures are the inmates of the house, so that they may wreak their wrath on these bits of wood and to save the real human occupants. When all is ready, a priest prays to old Mother Conma that she would be pleased to accept these dainty offerings and to close the open doors of the earth in order that the demons may not come forth to infest and injure the household. Again, effigies are often employed as means of preventing or curing sickness. The demons of disease either mistake the effigies for living people, are persuaded or compelled to enter them, leaving the real men and women well and whole. Thus, the alfors of Manasseh and Celebes will sometimes transport a sick man to another house while they leave on his bed a dummy made up of a pillow and clothes. This dummy, the demon is supposed to mistake for the sick man, who consequently recovers. Cure or prevention of this sort seems to find a special favor with the natives of Borneo. Thus, with an epidemic is raging among them, the Dyaks of the Kato Ingo River set up wooden images at their doors in the hope that the demons of the plague may be deluded into carrying off the effigies instead of the people. Among the Olo Gaju of Borneo, when a man sick is supposed to be suffering from the assaults of a ghost, puppets of dough or rice meal are made and thrown under the house as substitutes for the patient, who thus rids himself of the ghost. In certain of the western districts of Borneo, if a man is taken suddenly and violently sick, the physician, who in this part of the world is generally an old woman, fashions a wooden image and brings it 7 times into contact with the sufferer's head. While she says this image serves to take the place of the sick man, sickness passed over into the image. Then, with some rice, salt, and tobacco in a little basket, the substitute is carried to the spot where the evil spirit is supposed to have entered into the man. There it is set upright on the ground after the physician has invoked the spirit as follows. So sometimes the image dressed as a man or a woman according to the sex of the patient is deposited at a crossroad or other thoroughfare in the hope that some passerby seeing it may start and cry out, "Ah, so and so is dead." For such an exclamation is supposed to delude the demon of disease into a belief that he has accomplished his failed purpose. So he takes himself off and leaves the sufferer to get well. The Maidarat, a Sakai tribe of the Malay Peninsula, attribute all kinds of diseases to the agency of spirits, which they call yani. Fortunately, however, the magician can induce these maleficent beings to come out of the sick person and take up their abode in rude figures of grass, which are hung up outside the houses in little bell-shaped shrines decorated with peeled sticks. During an epidemic of smallpox, the Awe Negroes will sometimes clear a space outside of the town where they erect a number of low mounds and cover them with as many little clay figures as there are people in the place. Pots of food and water are also set out for the refreshment of the spirit of smallpox, who, it is hoped, will take the clay figures and spare the living folk. Okay, so pots of food and water are also set out for the refreshment of the spirit of smallpox, who it is hoped will take the clay figures and spare the living folk, and to make assurance doubly sure the road into the town is barricaded against him. With these examples before us, we may surmise that the woolen effigies, which at the festival of the Compitalia might be seen hanging at the doors of all the houses in ancient Rome, were not substitutes for human victims who had formerly been sacrificed at this reason, but rather vicarious offerings presented to the mother or grandmother of ghosts in the hope that on her rounds through the city she would accept or mistake the effigies for the inmates of the house and so spare the living for another year. It is possible that the puppets made of rushes, which in the month of May the pontiffs and Vestal virgins annually threw into the Tiber from the old Sublician bridge at Rome, had originally the same significance. That is, they may have been designed to purge the city from demoniac influence by diverting the attention of the demons from human beings to the puppets and then toppling the whole uncanny crew neck and crop into the river, which would soon sweep them far away out to sea. In precisely the same way the natives of old Calabar used periodically to rid their town of devils which infested it by luring the unwary demons into a number of lamentable scarecrows which they afterwards flung into the river. And that kind of puts you in the mind of Christ and the swine. So this interpretation of the Roman custom is supported to some extent by the evidence of Plutarch, who speaks of the ceremony as the greatest of purifications. So, with that, I'm going to leave you with something to think about. And I will be back later today with the homeopathic magic of a flesh diet. And we're going to get into why everybody loves to eat meat so much, why the Bible talks about eating meat so much, why everybody wants to sacrifice animals and eat animals, and what did the animals do and why do they got to die is what I want to know. So yes, stay tuned. More on that, more on sacrifice, more on bloodletting, more on meat eating madness. This is the presentation that I'm working on currently. I'm just reading these books because I'm really just researching and you guys are researching with me. So let's have some fun together. Let's continue to increase our wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Continue to allow the Creator to fill you with creativeness, to fill you with the spirit of love, joy, and just togetherness. And with that, I say shalom, everybody. Peace to all my empresses out there, my queens, my mothers, grandmothers, daughters, cousins, nieces, everybody. Um, Good morning, good night. I'm doing this at night, but it'll be on in the morning. So, shalom, everybody. Catch you later. Your sister Shaya. Like, share, subscribe. Don't forget to hit the Cash App or the PayPal, Sister for Sisters. You want to email me, you want hear me talk about something, you want to send me a book title, you can put it in the comments, or you can hit me on Facebook Messenger or send me an email at sisterforsisters@gmail.com.